let's turn to your book, which is being released. I think is it today? Um,
It came out yesterday.
oh, yesterday. And the new Arabs: How the Millennial Generation is Changing the Middle East. Who are the new Arabs?
Well, I'm talking about the Generation Y, or the Millennials, is what the demographers and marketers call them. The people born between the late 70s and the year 2000. And they're a very major cohort. They're over a third of the population of the Arab world, some 370 million Arabs in the world, so they're over nearly 40% of them. So it's an enormous youth bulge. The median age of the Arab world is only 24, which is half that of Germany or Japan. And these young people strike me as being quite remarkable and very different from their parents, whom I knew. They they're much more urban, much more literate, much more media savvy, hooked in with satellite television and the internet. Many of them have worked abroad, including in Europe. And they're across the board at least somewhat less religiously observant than their elders. So they are, a distinctive cohort.
And so, I mean, what is it about them that they aspire, I guess, to? I mean, I don't know. Democracy may be too crude of a word, but a more pluralistic, a more open society. Is it simply that they're just more sophisticated insofar as that they have more access to what, I guess, those a more pluralistic and open society would be about? I mean, what is it simply that they have access to it because of the technology, or what is it?
I think it is, in some important part, their access to satellite images and stories, and also the internet. Some European elections, the French election of last year between Francois Hollande and Nicolas Sarkozy, that is in a way a local event in a place like Tunisia, and people follow all those things, and so. When I first went to the Arab world back in the 70s, Sam, typically there was like one state television station, and their idea of news was long, loving shots of the dictator sitting on a Louis XIV chair with a visiting dignitary and playing John Philip Sousa in the background, and this would go on for 10 minutes, and with no commentary. So that was, it was a kind of symbolic television broadcast rather than being actual news, and a celebration of the dictatorship. And these dictators, became extremely corrupt. They put on almost royal airs, and then they started to imagine that they could pass on their presidencies for life to their eldest son. So they were becoming, in a way, a kind of monarchy in the republics. And the young people just decided they weren't going to put up with this. They weren't going to be inherited as though they were sticks of furniture. And they didn't want presidents for life, or republican monarchies. And they stopped it from happening. They got rid of 4 sitting presidents who had been long-time dictators, and they made a couple others very insecure. And then the sons are simply not going to inherit. It's not that most of the sons are on trial, and even in Egypt, which is newly authoritarian again, the new constitution limits the president to 2 4-year terms at most. So I think it's often not recognized that they really have changed the terms of the political game in the Arab world in very significant ways.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about their I guess their throwing over of I guess you use the term monarch publicanism or monarch public
Yeah.
Ist, I guess. I don't know how. And this was one of the achievements of the Arab Spring that you contend has at least. I mean, I wonder if I mean it's now obviously you can put in Egypt only 2 terms, and then at the end of those 2 terms, something often comes up. But I guess the idea is that there has been a change in this regard as to the psyche of the population in terms of what they expect and what they'll tolerate.
That's right. I really think it would be very difficult for the Egyptian constitution now to be changed, and General Abdel Fattah Sisi has taken off his uniform and become a civilian, and he's been elected president. But before he ran, I was in Egypt in March, and I heard him give a speech, and he forthrightly admitted, he said, those days where the military junta can just decide who the next president is going to be in Egypt are over with. Everybody understands, he said, that no one can be president of Egypt unless the Egyptian people vote him into office. And it's true that the election that he held was nothing to write home about. It probably isn't certifiable to international standards, but he did have an opponent, and it wasn't just a referendum. And he did feel as though he had to resort to the ballot box. He couldn't just stay as a dictator by fiat. And he does seem at the moment to be fairly popular. So the discourse of politics just has changed all around from what it was in 2009. And the same things are true in Tunisia and Libya. The elected prime minister in Tunisia, who oversaw the writing of a new constitution, it was demanded that he step down and that a government of technocrats be formed to oversee the coming elections, so that the incumbents don't, put their thumb on the scale. And there were massive demonstrations with this demand, and he ultimately did step down. Even though he had been fairly elected, in favor of a technocratic government in order to meet this popular demand of the youth and the labor unions. So this is the first time in modern history that, you had a civilian government that voluntarily relinquished power, an elected civilian government. And then even in Libya, which is, of course, a security mess, there's been a kerfuffle over who the prime minister should be, and Parliament voted somebody in, but there was a question as to whether he'd really gotten the sufficient number of votes. And it went to the Libyan Supreme Court, and they said no, he hadn't gotten enough votes to be prime minister. And he came out and gave a speech that, the rule of law is really important, and so I'm bowing out since the Supreme Court ruled in this way. Well, I mean, even though the Libyan government is very weak and it's not very important maybe, nevertheless, for politicians to talk like this and to act like this, I can't tell you how different it is from just a few years ago when you had this mercurial Gaddafi clan in power and they did whatever they wanted to do.
I mean, it's fascinating. To a certain extent, the institutions have yet to catch up with this massive, I guess, cultural shift. I mean, I guess maybe that's the best way to describe it.
Yeah.
And I think your argument in your book is that eventually they will. But let's talk about another cultural difference that you suggest that the Arab Spring brought about, or maybe it's even better to say this was a milestone where I guess a critical mass was achieved, was the notion of a more multicultural vision of how society should work in the context of the Arab world. Explain to us what that means and how that is a change as well.
Yes, well, the keynotes of politics in the 1950s and 60s were Arab nationalism, And this was a reaction in some large part to Western colonialism and imperialism in the region. So people were trying to recover their pride and their culture and their language and to some extent their religion. But this emphasis on Arabness was frequently done in a very chauvinist way, and the people who proposed it didn't take into account that there are fair numbers of ethnic minorities in the Arab world that don't think of themselves as Arab. You have the Kurds in Iraq, you have the Berbers or Amazigh people in many countries of North Africa. And in Gaddafi's Libya, for instance, the Amazigh language was just forbidden in public, and people couldn't celebrate their culture as Berbers. There were also, forms of discrimination against the Amazigh in Morocco, and so ethnic forms of discrimination are not viewed positively on the whole in this younger generation. And so after the revolution against Gaddafi in Libya, the Amazigh have started having cultural festivals, and their language has been recognized as a legitimate Libyan language. And the young people, the bloggers and so forth, are celebrating this change. Also in Morocco, actually, it didn't have a revolution, but there were a lot of demonstrations in 2011, and the young king is rather savvy, and he had a new constitution fashioned to try to meet some of these protesters' demands, and that constitution gives official status to the Amazigh language in Morocco, and my Berber friends from Morocco are much happier with their situation now in the aftermath. So there's more ethnic multiculturalism and recognition of minority rights among the younger generation. Also, with regard to religion, most of these countries have a majority that's, except in Iraq, is Sunni. Sunni Muslim in orientation, but Egypt has a significant Coptic Christian minority, between 5 and 10%. Syria has likewise probably 5% Christians, and Tunisia even has a small Jewish, and Morocco as well have small Jewish communities. And the youth, again, they celebrate the rights of these religious minorities, and I can't tell you how outraged my Tunisian young friends were when Salafis chanted against Jews. So I think there's a real sea change in these kinds of attitudes.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and let's turn to the some of the, I guess, the youth that you focus on, and your overall thesis is that in some ways it mirrors, I think, the way that we talk about Occupy, the Occupy movement in this country, that that people have dispersed into sort of other areas and are learning organizational traits and skill sets that when they come of age, I guess, that they will then will see applied to government. I mean, you talk about that in the context of, particularly in Egypt, of the disbursement of a lot of the people who were part of the youth, I guess, element of the movement, because and I think we've spoken in the past that one of the key factors to what happened, at least in Egypt, was the youth reaching out to labor, essentially. And there were, I can't remember, 1,300 labor strikes in the years leading up to Tahrir Square. Talk about that as to where those leaders have gone, the youth leaders.
Well, it depends on the country. The youth leaders of these youth organizations, they often have the word youth in their names, and they organize themselves for the promotion of the interests of their generation. They do tend to be liberal or left of center, and they in Tunisia, as I said, they reached out to labor unions and had a big impact on the political process again in summer and fall of 2013. And in Libya, there are enormous numbers of new non-governmental organizations, charity work, promotion of literacy, water provision, all kinds of things they're involved in. And in fact, there's more of a demand for volunteers and workers in these than there is a supply. And the youth predominate in them. So if you walked into one of these NGOs' offices, you'd find 25-year-olds sitting there. And this is the kind of thing they can do, because in many of these countries, they're not old enough to stand for office. We forget, I think, sometimes how young they are. And people ask me, why didn't they form political parties? And I think of them less like Occupy, although that's maybe, there are some analogies there, but more like Greenpeace and those kinds of civil society organizations that promote particular causes and which are organized as networks rather than as political parties, but which have an impact on public policy. And that's the kind of thing that these young people continue to be involved in. Unfortunately, in Egypt, the turn to authoritarianism has been such that some of the more prominent activists of the past decade are now in prison. The military-backed government passed a draconian anti-protest law that you can't protest unless you get permission from the Minister of Interior, and the youth say that the government doesn't seem to understand the concept of protest. So they've defied that law, and some of them have been sentenced to as many as 3 years of hard labor. There's a kind of determination on the part of the Egyptian older elite to put this genie back in the bottle and to stop these rounds of huge protests by the youth. And so they're trying to make object lessons of the youth leaders. But I would be very surprised if they succeed.
Can you characterize, overall in terms of what happened with the Arab Spring, can it be characterized, and when you talk about the three achievements of essentially changing the cultural perspective of the Marnock oblivism, forgive me, the idea of a sort of a quasi-monarchy, presidency type of situation, or the sort of lack of accountability, and the notion of a more multicultural society, within limitations, I guess. But can you characterize what happened in the Arab Spring as being driven more as almost some type of social emancipation or civil rights, again with an asterisk, movement, or was there also, how much of it was also about an economic struggle?
Well, economics were a very big part of it. The youth face very high rates of unemployment, and educated youth face higher rates of unemployment than less educated youth. And they felt that it was the presidents for life, the family cartels, the corruption that discouraged foreign investment in their countries, and that they believed that if they could change the political system so as to be more open and more accountable, that in turn would spur economic growth and provide them with jobs. A lot of these young people who are activists are from left-wing families, so they're the equivalent of red diaper babies. They're themselves not oriented towards parties so much, but they are very sympathetic to the plight also of industrial workers and of village farmers who often now are lacking in water, in part because of government policy, in part because of climate change. And so they've used their bully pulpit of blogging and the internet and Facebook to mount campaigns on behalf of their less fortunate colleagues. And remember, many of the farmers and the factory workers are also in their 20s, and so there's a kind of generational solidarity there. So they were convinced that if they could change the political system, they could, also affect the economic stagnation. And it is true that the Arab world is peculiar in the low degree of direct investment, and so they're not wrong about that. And I think in Tunisia, things are working out over time so that they may well be proved right in their theory about this. And even in Egypt, the Gulf now has pledged very large amounts of money and investment in the aftermath of the overthrow of the Muslim Brotherhood government. So Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, which they were putting their money in Western banks and Spanish real estate and so forth. They've agreed really to put tens of billions of dollars into Egypt. So that economic dimension is certainly a big part of how these events have unfolded.
Fascinating. Well, and I guess we'll have a real sense of what the Arab summer, to the extent that it does come, maybe we're 10 years out or so. I mean, when these people, I guess, get a little bit older and begin to gain power.
Yes, I mean, I think if we think about it, if there were 25 when they made these revolutions, it's still 30 years before we see them in high government office. So many of their generational achievements are still way in the future. But I maintain they've changed the region and in some ways the world for the better, in powerful ways. It's soon to write them off.
Well, Professor Juan Cole, the book is The New Arabs, How the Millennial Generation is Changing the Middle East. We'll, of course, put a link up at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today.
It's been wonderful talking, Sam. Thanks so much.